I'm just going to take one reading this morning, and it's from the reading from the first letter of John. John was one of the 12 disciples, as we know, the one that was very close to Jesus. It says that when they sat around the table, he would lean on his Lord's chest. They were very, very intimate, very close, and it's him who is writing this first of three letters. It's 1 John 4, and it's just a few verses, 7 to 13. And he writes this: "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. So we know that we live in him, and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
If you ever read 1 John through, the first letter, and particularly the central part of it, he seems to be going round and round in circles as he talks about love all the time. He talks about the love of God. The love of God is of God, it's from God, and the one who loves God is demonstrated they are born of God, and they therefore know God. Therefore we should love one another. We know the love of God because we've seen it in Jesus, who's died for us. And it all started, of course, says John, with God's love for us. And so our love is a response to his love, as his love is the source of our love, and so on. It's all about love. It'd be interesting to count how many times he uses the word love. And so you can tell by the end of the letter that he's really, really enthusiastic about love. It's like these people that talk about Star Wars all the time. You know, they're so caught up in it, don't they? So enthused by their subject. There's an old apocryphal story. I don't know if it's true, but it certainly resonates truth. And that is an old story about when St. John, who was in exile on the island of Patmos, that he used to teach his disciples every day. And it said that he would sit with them for hours, just talking to them and teaching them about about Jesus. And one of his disciples once said, complained to him and said, "John, whenever you talk about Jesus or God, you always talk about love. All the time, it's love, about God's love for us, about our love for one another." He said, "Why don't you tell us something else besides love?" And the disciple who, I said, in his youth had laid his head on the heart of God, made man, on Jesus, his said replied, "Because there's nothing else. There's just love." So overwhelmed was he by the love of Jesus that he could think about nothing else. And I suppose once you've encountered that love, once you've come as close to it as he has, once you've seen it in operation in your life, and once you become convinced of this love, then I suppose there's nothing else that you can really talk about. And so what that story is telling us is that's what John was like. He was overwhelmed by the love of God. But if we look back in his life, it wasn't always like that with John. I mean, he had a brother called James, and they didn't always get on. In fact, they bickered and they quarrelled all the time, and they were such angry, difficult characters that Jesus gave them a nickname, and he called them Boanerges. And Boanerges in the Greek means sons of thunder. Because when they got together and they fell out, it was like thunder and lightning. They were going at each other all the time, the two boys. And also, both of them, it has to be said, were rather insensitive and selfish and ambitious. When Jesus once told his disciples that he's going up to Jerusalem and he's going to be arrested and he's going to be tried and he's going to be crucified, then almost immediately afterwards, James and John said to him, "Excuse me, but when you come into your kingdom, can we sit at the right or the left-hand side?" Nothing about, well, it'll be sad if you died or if you're going to go, but no, when you come in your kingdom, what about us? And so when Jesus was arrested too, remember that John was one of those who ran away. Didn't stay to defend his master, just all ran away with the rest of them. So much for his love for Jesus at that stage in his life. But then something dramatically changed in John's life. He stopped being angry. His anger cooled. He set aside all ambition, all self-seeking, and he would talk, as we've heard, over and over again in his letters and in his gospel about love. So what happened that changed this angry, selfish, ambitious young man to somebody that can only talk about and exude, if you like, love? What happened? What changed him? Well, very simply this. He opened his heart and he let God in. Up until then, he'd shut him out. He'd locked the door from the inside. And he didn't want to go any further than just being a disciple. But at some stage, the door opened and Jesus was allowed through his Spirit to come in. I think it's interesting to note that the same John wrote the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. It's a very scary book, and it's a bit of a confusing book, and it's not an easy book to read. But there are some parts of it that are quite startling and quite clear. For example, in chapter 3, we have Jesus speaking to what is a rather self-centered, self-satisfied, lukewarm church in a place called Laodicea. And Jesus' words to this church perhaps are an echo of the message that John himself heard through Jesus as he broke into his little world. And this is what Jesus says to this church in Laodicea. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. He's knocking on the door of this church and saying, let me in so I can change and transform you. And it's interesting because if you look back into John's Gospel, for example, he makes, you hear an echo of that promise there in chapter 14. Jesus says, whoever has my commands and obeys them, he is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. And then he goes on to say that if we love God and keep his commandments, then he will come in and be with him. So here is John then, having done this himself, and I was hearing Jesus saying the same thing to the church of Laodicea. He has joined his life with Jesus, and that life has been filled with what is, I suppose, a supernatural love. And so he could make this plea to his friends, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Now we have to be careful with that word love, because it's no big deal. We say, well, love, I can love somebody else. I love my parents, I love my husband or wife, I love my children, my friends, my dog. I'm already loving, so I'm there already. But what we forget is that this word love here is a different word for love. This word here is the word agape. And agape was a very, very, a word that you don't find much anywhere else. And they took this word and they used it to apply to Jesus. Because when they met Jesus, saw his love for everybody, the blind, the dumb, even his enemies, then they realized, particularly when he died on the cross and said, forgive them, they realized this love of Jesus was greater than any other love. In other words, it was a supernatural love, which is many times greater than our own natural love. And that word agape is the word that John used over and over again. He says, the love of God, agape. You should love others with the love of God, agape. Do you see? So it's the only kind of love that you and I can have if Jesus has entered into our hearts. And God is a part of our lives, because that love of God, the agape love, then begins to come and manifest itself in our lives. And so when he says, everyone who loves, agape, has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love, agape, does not know God, because God is love, agape. It's all agape love. So it's only as we unlock the door of our lives and let Jesus in that we become new people. As he gives us something of his heart for our hearts, then we become more like Jesus. I read a paper recently, I don't know why, and it was making the observation that people who have heart transplants, you heard of people having heart transplants, and over the last 50 or 60 years, they've been observing that when they have the heart of another person, they take on some of the characteristics or the personality of the person whose heart's been donated. And they're trying to figure out, how is this now? Is it something at the cellular level? What is it? Is our personality, our character somehow impregnated in our organs? So when you take an organ, you put it in somebody else, some of you goes with you. And I thought it's a very interesting idea, because when Jesus gives us his heart and he transplants it within ours, then we take on some of his personality. And we see something like this in the book of Ezekiel. Remember, Ezekiel once said, God said, through Ezekiel, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. 2,600 years ago, the prophet Ezekiel, God was saying through the prophet Ezekiel, look, I'm going to take out the heart of stone and I'm going to replace it with my heart of flesh, the heart of love. And when I do that, you will take on my personality and learn to love. A heart transplant. And that's exactly what happened to John and countless of millions of other people. One minute God was kind of distant, or they tried to follow him, do the commandments, go to church, all that kind of stuff, but they weren't changed until they opened the door of their hearts and their lives, and Jesus was able to come in, take out the heart of stone and put in it the heart of flesh, the heart that loves with the agape, the supernatural love of God, which loves not just friends and family and dogs, but enemies as well. The love of Jesus. That's what a Christian is, at the heart of it. The heart of it. A Christian is someone who has had a heart transplant and now knows Jesus as part of their lives. Amen.